Well, I'm not sure what happened right now, but I lost connection and I just came
Me,
back. So it looks like well, we're still recording and we're still live streaming, so everything is up. Um, I'm not sure what happened.
okay, so we waited a little bit to see if Reza comes back online, yes?
Yes, a bit. I'm a co-host. My name's Alan.
Okay,
So
hi.
I can. So one of the
Okay,
questions that. Oh, okay. Raise this back.
Hi
I,
again.
I'm back. Sorry. Looks like I
Great.
had an internet disconnectivity. So I don't know if there were any questions while I was gone, or shall I continue asking the?
There's a couple in the chat, and one of them is: are there any sample return missions planned?
Well, there are several experiments already going on. Some already happened, some are happening at the moment, where we actually take fungal samples from our planet, of course, and we take them to International Space Station and to the Chinese Space Station. So some experiments already happened at the International Space Station and some are happening at the Chinese one. And the idea is just to have different fungal species being exposed to the environments there and see what happens in real outer space conditions, not just simulated on Earth.
So are you seeing mutations because of like gamma rays or increased radiation or less shielding, or are you doing like shielding experiments
Sorry,
to see about mutations?
can, can you repeat again? The sound
I was just kind
got...
of thinking off the top of my head, is that are you seeing mutations? So you send a sample up, and is it mutating and
Yes.
changing due to the radiation or
So
gamma particles?
we're we're seeing a bit of everything, even because we've been trying different types of experiments. So one of the experiments done at the International Space Station was not just having them inside the space station, but outside the space station, so completely exposed to radiation. And we've seen species that actually survive and don't change much when outside of the space station. This is because some of the species tested, they produce a compound called melanin. And this is something that usually makes them dark and confers them protection against radiation. And they can drive and survive really well at really high values of radiation. So this depends on the species. Some of them get changed and are a bit more affected by the stress conditions in the outer space, but others are already pre-programmed and prepared for all sort of extremes that we can find in space environments. So we have amazing species.
Have you had any
So,
samples escape to the outside and growing or on the outside of the space station? Just out of curiosity, or
not that we've know of, but it's not impossible. But we've never detected any like that. But fungi, some of the species, they produce spores, and spores can stay in this dormant condition for a very long time, especially if they don't find the preferred conditions for them to grow. So you can easily imagine a situation where spores are released into space. They don't like the environment around, so they stay in this dormant status until they reach conditions that they will consider agreeable or nicer, and then they'll start developing. So if you consider this, that is something that could easily happen. But so far, we have not detected anything like this.
Okay, so these fungi can not only withstand vacuum, but radiation also. So do astronauts clean the outside of the space station as well?
No, what happens is that we assume that the conditions outside the space station are too extreme for the majority of the organisms to actually cause any issues and start adhering or growing. So of course, we know that there are certain species that could somehow survive and eventually do that, but they don't exist there on their natural, it's not part of the natural resources. So spacecrafts, they are assembled in these clean rooms to diminish as much as possible any potential contamination. And the species that we know that survive, those tend to be taken on purpose only, not just by chance. So far, we think that's a minimal risk. So we're not thinking of that for the moment.
Oh, I have a quick question about fungi. I had such an appreciation for your lecture tonight.
Thank
Earlier
you.
this year, I swallowed mold.
Okay, so you're Kim, because I see a
I'm
question.
Kim.
What happened?
Yes, I reached into my refrigerator thinking that I was, grabbing some tuna, and I thought, oh, what am I eating? This tastes like gunk. And it didn't even taste bad. I thought, oh, this tastes like potatoes. And all of a sudden, I looked at it, and it had gone all white with these black spots. And oh my gosh! And I called her. I gotta die. And then I was just
Okay.
thinking penicillin, right?
So there's many different fungi that can actually grow on food, and well, you're not gonna die, so you're okay.
Thank you.
But do avoid eating them in the future. So you have all sorts of species that can grow, we know that. And the thing is, if you're able to see them, if you're already seeing a fluffy thing or a black spot, that means that there's a lot more growing that you don't see. And you have to take into consideration that these fungi, they can produce all sorts of things. Mycotoxins, they're really dangerous toxins. They can cause problems, especially if you have long-term consumption of this type of substances. So it's always better to avoid them. So whenever you have a half-rotten fruit, don't just cut the little bit that you can see. Just think, if you see a little bit on the skin with the fluffy filaments growing, that means that underneath the skin you have a lot of the food being contaminated. So it's always better just to avoid eating, to avoid issues in the long term, than to actually eat them. So whenever possible, don't eat. But at the same time, we do have certain species that we consume their biomass directly. Corn products are produced using biomass of fungi. So, some species are good, some species are not. But because at home you don't have any way to identify them and distinguish them, just avoid eating fungi that you cannot identify at home. Just go for the mushrooms. Those are safer, at least the ones that you buy in the supermarket.
Oh, I like those. Thank you.
I have another question. Have you had any access to any of the samples returned from some of the asteroids to see if there's any
No.
kind of fungi on them?
No. So far, no fungi has been found on asteroid samples. We have found organic matter on asteroids, but not fungal samples. So the fungi that we found, that we work with, we take on purpose to environments like space stations, but we don't find them so far wandering in space. And either it has to be a matter that is released from Earth in order to increase the possibility of having fungi wandering in space. But if it's something coming towards us from outer space somewhere, there's no chance that they're going to have fungi unless they came across a bit of something from Earth.
Okay, and speaking of these things, so you mentioned the access to Chinese space station. So
Yes.
can you tell us more about that? How active is it? How many people are there? Do you know?
Well, I don't know the exact number of astronauts currently at the Chinese space station, but what I do know is that the International Space Station is coming to an end, so it's gonna stop functioning in some years, and the only option available will only be, at least so far, the Chinese space station. And the Chinese space station is actually open to everyone around the world. So anyone who wants to work or have experiments done at the Chinese space station, they can apply. And if the projects are selected, then they'll have a chance. And there's projects running with people from all different countries in there. And it's fully active. People tend to think mostly about the International Space Station. But yes, it's up and running.
Okay, great. And also you mentioned about the issue at the Mir. So what happened? The fungi grow and prevent the electronics from working?
Yes. So During those times, that was the beginning of space exploration. People didn't really think much about potential contaminations outside of planet because people just thought, okay, if we're sending something to outer space outside of our planet, it's going to be sterile. Nothing is going to grow there. But actually, fungi, they are really amazing organisms. They can grow in all sorts of substrate. You have fungi that develop well in rocks, for example, and even with high exposure of sun. So once the Mir station was released, after some time, they started having electrical shortages in the circuits just because fungi started to grow really well over metal and plastic, and they started corroding everything. So it was the major reason for Mir to actually shut down and stop functioning was actually fungi. So yes, they're guilty of that.
Okay, it was that bad.
Yes.
It also deteriorate some of the hull components and things.
Yes, they did. Because they were growing basically everywhere. There were no measures regarding avoiding any contamination. So they just grew randomly everywhere. Don't imagine a forest inside the Mir station. Just think of them as spots coming up in all the different places and eventually affecting critical circuits.
And what about the astronaut health? I guess the spores will be airborne as well, and then might cause problems.
Yes, so that's exactly one of the main reasons when you think of the clinical aspect of fungi in space exploration, because if fungi can become a bit more aggressive in terms of growth, because we are seeing that many of the species, they have their growth promoted in outer space conditions. So if they can grow faster, this means that if they are infectious, they will infect us faster. And if you think that the immune system of astronauts also gets depressed, then this also favors those organisms that become a bit more powerful. So they kind of can easily just take over and cause a lot of serious issues. However, health astronaut is really, really well followed and well checked up. So we're always aware of everything that's happening. And the environment inside spacecraft and space stations is really, really well controlled. So as soon as some issue is detected, is also immediately addressed. And when it comes to contamination, we try to diminish that as much as possible. So at least until now, we have had no major issues. And if there were any issues, they were not reported. So far so good. But we really need to be careful because we see this happening with climate change. So climate change, basically, the main thing is that we're seeing an increase in temperature in our planet. And if you think of this, we've been also noticing an increase in emerging fungal infections. And this is mostly because of climate change. So if this happens in our own planet, if we think of outer space that has even other stress factors, we might have similar issues. So we might have fungi that initially didn't cause us any trouble, starting to look at us as like a host to infect. So, we need to be really careful. That's why we are in desperate need of more people doing research in astromycology, because space exploration is becoming more a topic and something that everyone is doing. There's more and more countries investing on this, and more companies investing in space exploration. So we need to be really careful, and we need to know as much as possible as soon as possible before any major issue happens.
You mentioned that the astronauts spend a lot of time cleaning, and also we know that the stuff we send to space are made in clean rooms. So the question is, are those the primary measures to guard against fungi proliferation in space, or what other measures are taken?
Well, because the environment is a closed environment, it's an environment that is easy to control, let's say this. So any growth happening there, it's easy to check and control. And yes, those are the main critical aspects of it. But even assembling things in clean rooms, we cannot exclude everything in terms of contamination. There's always a minor percentage that we cannot control, and we consider that, but we consider that it's a minimal risk that is not worth worrying. Even because if we're taking a lot of other organisms with us, and we cannot just sterilize our microbiome. So, we're going and we're taking a multitude with us. So we have to just consider that and work around that, because we cannot kill all the organisms. Even if we do, we will not survive. We need those organisms as part of our own health to make sure that we are okay. So, there's still a lot that we need to consider. There are no short answers in any of this.
Okay, great. Thank you. And going back to the history, do you know if there were any fungi or fungi problems on the early American missions, like the Apollo?
So again, at those times, people didn't really consider contaminations. So if there were any issues, they were not reported or not even initially accounted for. But I think we were quite lucky because things happened and no major problems were found. So yes, I think everything went quite well.
Okay. Good. And you mentioned different conditions that you simulate for fungi growth, like the vacuum, the extremes and stuff. Do you also simulate soil and other conditions that model any of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and try to see if fungi growth there is a possibility?
So in my research, I tend to focus on our own moon and Mars, just because those parameters are better established and we know a bit more about these. But there are groups, not mine, but there are groups that focus on some of the icy moons and other environments. But in my case, it's just basically moon and Mars.
Okay. And you also mentioned that some fungi can create a protective shield, myelin, if I'm saying that correctly, that actually makes them immune to UV and other radiation. So can you elaborate more? So basically, we cannot use UV to sterilize them in a space?
So it depends on the species, but when I referred that before, I was talking about specifically a group of fungi which we call black fungi, and they are black because they have within their structure a compound that it's called melanin, and that kind of works as a protector of those fungal cells. So that's why they withheld high amounts of radiation. And melanin is a substance that we've been exploring for different applications, even for Earth applications, because melanin protects against radiation, not just on fungi. But the black fungi, they produce it naturally. So that's how they become these super resistant fungi.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is about SpaceX. Do you know about their spacesuit, and is that an improvement in terms of fungi protection?
Well, regarding SpaceX specifically, I have to say that I don't know. When it comes to spacesuits, we've been trying all different types of materials, including all sorts of products to test what works best. But SpaceX exactly, I don't know what they use. What I do know is that, for example, one of my projects has to do with the incorporation of metal nanoparticles produced by fungi in order to be incorporated in textiles so that we can use in some of the structures, not spacesuits, but internal structures inside space stations and spacecraft, just to avoid fungal contamination in these types of products.
Okay, great. And you also showed us how you simulate the supergravity situation,
Yes.
and also that device that does the microgravity. So let me just make sure. You said that you leave the device running for like 2 weeks. So that's
Yes.
spinning 2 weeks. Okay.
Yeah, so I can elaborate a bit more about that. So the equipment that we have in our own lab is the clinostat, which is something about this size, more or less, and we fit it inside an incubator. And that simulates different values of microgravity. And it can even simulate hypergravity, but only up to 3G. The large diameter centrifuge, which unfortunately we don't have in our lab, but we were lucky enough to have access to it to the HyperJazz program from ESA and UNOSA. What we did was we actually had access to it. And each of those red boxes that you saw in the picture, they're called gondolas. They are very heavy. They can take up to 8 kilograms of weight inside. So one person can actually fit inside. And you can put whatever you want to expose to hypergravity inside those gondolas. And then you can just leave the gondola working for as long as you need. So I've heard that they've had projects where they had the gondola, the large diameter centrifuge working for months. In our case, because we know that fungal generation usually is up to only 1 week, so we had fungi growing for 2 weeks, even because we didn't have more time. The project only granted us 2 weeks to use the centrifuge. So we used them to expose fungi during those 2 weeks to see what happened. But fungi, they are affected by microgravity, but regarding hypergravity, at least from the results that we found so far, and we're still treating our data, they are not affected at all by hypergravity. And at the time, so the large diameter centrifuge can simulate hypergravity up to 20G. And because there's no research done on fungi with this, we didn't know which values to choose for our exposure. So we thought, okay, let's just try 15G, and in case they don't survive 15G, let's try 10G. So you can do the exposure to 10G and 15G at the same time, depending on how you set the gondolas. So we tried 15G and 10G for the 2 weeks without knowing what to expect. But so far we found that they don't care about hypergravity. The fungi that grew over those 2 weeks just grew as if they were at normal gravity without any issues, both in terms of production of metabolites, everything. So it's quite amazing.
Okay, so hypergravity does not affect them, but microgravity causes them to reproduce faster.
Yes, not all. So this is species dependent.
Well,
So the majority of them grows faster, but we also have species that grow slower and some that don't seem to be affected at all. For the hypergravity experiment, we tested 20 different species and none of them seemed affected in any way. But in microgravity, we find that the majority of them does get affected, but we also get others that don't or get affected in a different way.
Thank you. And before I go with the next question, let me do a last call for questions. If anybody has any, please do send them. So the next question, you already mentioned that, but if you could elaborate more on. So it takes 1 week for a generation of fungi to live their life. Okay, that's species dependent and other stuff, of course. How does that affect your research? Does it make it easier because the time span is short and you could see the changes and mutations and stuff?
Okay, it's not a yes or a no, but if you consider that you have other organisms, even within fungal species, that take up to 1 month, or if you think of archaea, that can take up to several months to grow, then just for me to do an experiment would take forever, even then to get the results. But at the same time, if you think of bacteria that have a generation time, some of them of hours, then if I work with bacteria, I could generate a lot more data much faster. So 7 days, which is the majority, the time that the majority of the filamentous fungi take to do a full generation, 7 days is not that bad. So, it's okay. But some species do grow a bit faster and some do grow much slower. So it depends.
Okay, great. Sorry, go ahead, Alan.
Question. Have you had access to any of like the really deep core old samples, like in Antarctica when they do the deep cores? Stuff that's been hidden for thousands of years.
So from the samples that we got from Antarctica, they were not very deep. So they were from water sample and sediments up to 20 centimeters down the soil. But for the Red Sea, for the expedition that I went, we collected samples up to 4 meters below the bottom of the sea. So those are samples that are really, really difficult to reach. And we're still working on those and don't know exactly what to expect.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have another question, and that concerns spacesuits again. If there is fungi in the air in the space station, do they get transferred to the spacesuit when they cover it, or is there a mechanism to prevent that, or how does that work?
So there's mechanisms inside the space station. The astronauts are not always wearing spacesuits, so they use the spacesuits to go outside the space station. The spacesuits, however, have all sorts of filters within them, and the same happens at the space station. So the space station has several high-efficiency particulate matter filters, which are called HEPA filters, and they tend to avoid the spread of any contamination that might actually exist. So the air circulates in a way that it's always being filtered to avoid any major issues. But inside the space station, astronauts don't wear the suits.
Okay, great. That was it all for us. Thank you very much, Marta. That was a great talk. And we're actually looking forward to get more information as your research continues about fungi.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Before I end the meeting, do you have any final remarks?
No, I just wanted to thank you again for inviting me here and for giving me the chance to talk a bit about the work that I do and that is done in astromycology. If you're curious, anyone, just reach out, and thank you again. It was a pleasure.
Sure. Thank you again very much for doing the talk for us. So let me also thank the audience for attending and staying with us. I hope to see everybody on the next month's meeting. For more information about everything and the events, you could check out our website at ocastronomers.org. With that said, I wish everybody a great time ahead and say bye-bye.